Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Yo, dear listeners, hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today, I'm sitting with Dr. Scott Stevenson, who I'm very excited to interview. Scott, thanks so much for joining the show.
You're very welcome, my friend. Yeah, my pleasure.
So, what I want to talk to you today about is a bit of a compare and contrast type conversation where we're going to talk about how researchers typically measure hypertrophy or muscle growth in the lab versus practical strategies for the layperson like me, for example, to do it in the gym, assessing how your training program and how each individual session might be contributing to overall hypertrophy. And I was thinking about the outline that I sent you before this podcast, and it made me realize that I was asking you to discuss this because without even noticing, without conscious reflection, I was trying to marry two aspects of the content that you put out and the way that you come across on social media and on other podcasts that I really like about you, because you're really good at simplifying science, complicated science concepts, and make them applicable. And also, you're really good at integrating that science with practical application.
Thank you. I have a simple brain, so I can't complicate things too much. The brain doesn't allow it. But I do appreciate the compliment very much. That's
all right. Well, when I interview a new guest, Scott, normally I want to give them the opportunity to introduce themselves to my audience in case there's somebody who lives under a rock and doesn't know who you are, given how long you've been contributing to the industry. So my icebreaker question is, who are you? What do you do? And why are you so awesome at it?
I like the awesome part. I am not very good at self-aggrandizing, so I'm probably going to miss the mark on the why I'm so awesome. The thing that I guess you mentioned I've been around for a while, and that's a good reason why people would know who I am. I've just been here since sort of the dawn of the internet, so to speak. And I've been a curious scientist. I want to know what's going on, geek, nerd, bodybuilding related for years. I'm just a very, very curious person, but I'm also a meathead through and through. So I've tried to, I like the way you said this. I've married these two things. And my goal is, I've just inadvertently along the way become quote unquote an influencer by definition. I have a friend who's sort of an expert in social media and marketing. Like she's like, oh, you're a micro influencer. That's based on the number of followers I have. But my goal is just to be a teacher. My goal is to hand over ideas to people so that they can then make use of them as they will. And we tend to us them. It's just a natural human tendency, and you see this very strongly in the bodybuilding world. There's the evidence-based crowd. Sometimes they call them abstract warriors, people who go to the science every single time because there's obviously a massive body of literature there and understanding that can be had from digging in, not just reading the abstracts, but digging in and learning what happens in the controlled environment of scientific studies. And then there are the guys who've been there, done that, who've been living in the trenches for years, for decades. I've been training now for over 40 years. I started when I was 11. I'm in my mid 50s now. So people sometimes would come up to me and just say, hey, how long have you been training? I said, well, longer than you've been alive. Let's just leave it at that. And that's very often, it's almost always the correct answer because I'm getting these questions from young guys a lot of times. So I try to bring those things together. So that's my path has been sort of varied and various and sundry. I was a college professor for years. I got my PhD back in the 90s, actually, the late 90s, was a college professor. I'm actually a licensed acupuncturist. I maintain that license, so I've got a health related focus as well. I have a graduate certificate in gerontology alongside my PhD in exercise physiology. I owned a gym for several years. I started I first became a personal trainer in '93. So I did that for many moons along the way, and started coaching people before we even called it that. And then I've written, I guess, the probably the most important thing for people to know is that I've got a brain dump that I put out several years ago now called "Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach," and this really captures my perspective, or at least the place where I like to put myself along the spectrum of coaching and learning is that, and this is where your the podcast. You have a great question for today, so don't let me ramble too long. Um, but many people, at one end of the spectrum, people are looking for the aesthetic, the outward appearance of being fit, looking fit, and all the things that come with the simple physical fitness aspects of it. I think a very important aspect of intrinsic good, so to speak, is what happens in challenging yourself and undergoing the learning process. And when people just tell you what to do or feed you the fish, as I like to say it, whereas you're not learning how to fish, then you miss out on that learning process. And then you're relying upon coaches. And I've seen this in innumerable ways over the years, people who simply without their personal trainer, without their coach, or without someone handing them instructions as to how to do the various fitness activities they want to do, they're really becoming capable of doing that. So my book is about, it's about how you don't need a coach to do the things that most people presume nowadays you need to have a coach to do. So I'm shooting myself in the foot as far as coaching goes intentionally. I don't do like regular. I did that for decades, regular coaching where people check in, because I found that over the course of time, people figure out, okay, we're gonna add some food to this meal, or we're gonna take some food away from this meal, or we're gonna change the exercise selection. It becomes very, very simple. It's not rocket science. Um, so anyway, so that's kind of what I do. I try to inform people and then do deep dives every once in a while into topics. And we won't go too deep, but into topics like this, so people can make sense of exactly what you're saying, like what's going on in the research world where they're measuring hypertrophy. And actually, I kind of have an issue almost with that term, and there's some reasons why, or muscle growth. That's what I prefer to use. And like, can I apply this stuff? I can't take biopsies. I don't have an ultrasound machine. I can't just hop into an MRI. How do I make use of this? So this is the quintessential question in bodybuilding. Really, if you think about it, from the beginner standpoint, you want to lose body fat, but guys almost always want to gain as much muscle mass as possible, within reason, of course, based on the parameters they set for themselves in terms of what other things they're going to use to promote muscle growth. So that's me in a long nutshell.
Well, Scott, now that you basically said you have a book that's trying to put me out of a job, I'm going to end the podcast here. This is never going to
Okay,
see the light of day.
don't even publish it. This is going well. It was, yeah. Okay, that was the shortest podcast I've ever done. We're
Well,
11
I
minutes
thought
in.
that was going to go so well. 8 minutes,
Yeah,
wow, we're a
what
record.
the
Nah,
heck?
I'm joking.
Okay.
I actually encourage anyone to read that book. And well, what you said about teaching people how to fish versus feeding them a fish is a cornerstone of my own coaching method. It really resonates with me because the way I put it is I wouldn't want a client of mine to see me as a crutch, and I would want them to
Hmm.
be able to at least maintain the results after working with me. If I can't get
Hmm.
them to that point, I've not done a good job as a coach.
Yeah.
And I am really keen on teaching people how to fish when it comes to assessing research and in particular how we can measure muscle growth in the lab, especially nowadays where it's great that we have so much research being shared on social media for the layperson to be able to see, as opposed to it being behind a paywall as it used to be most of the time. But also
Hmm.
with that comes the fact that people are starting to almost weaponize research to become bigger
Yes.
influencers. And I think it's important that the layperson is given the tools to understand it a little bit better and have a bit more of a critical eye when it comes to a reel they might see on Instagram or a post
Hmm.
that supposedly interprets that research. I am also I really love language, and I always like to delve into descriptions and definitions because it helps to get
Mm.
everyone on the same page. So when you said that you take issue with the term hypertrophy when it comes to measuring hypertrophy and you prefer to say muscle growth, I'd be really curious to ask you what you mean by that.
Yeah. So the original sense of the word hypertrophy is an increase in cell size. So um, you would this is just a biological definition. We've sort of taken that term and used it in general to mean an increase in the size of an entire muscle. And then there is this debate, which is very difficult to finally settle in many people's minds, that there is such a thing, or potentially such a thing, in human muscle whereby there could be hyperplasia, so an increase in the number of cells that you have. So, in general, there are these two major ways in which muscle could get bigger, and not necessarily. You could actually have hyperplasia, and the muscle doesn't get bigger; you just have more cells. And we can go into the woods here. This is a really interesting topic for me. Um, but when you're talking about hypertrophy, that really means, and this is from someone who, my school was in the 90s, and people, and I learned from a guy, and I did muscle biopsies when I was in school. We're measuring muscle cell cross sectional area, which is a measurement of the muscle size. Sorry, the muscle cell size. So that's hypertrophy, right? But an MRI, which I also did when I was in graduate school, is going to give you a whole muscle cross sectional area. So, for instance, there's a study from 2006. D'Antona is the first author, and they looked at size of the vastus lateralis in an MRI and compared um, control subjects, untrained, and bodybuilders. And the bodybuilders' vastus laterali were like 50+% larger than the control group. But the fiber cross sectional area of all the different fiber types they looked at was only like 14% bigger, something along that. So the question is then, well, how is the muscle so much bigger if the fibers aren't that much bigger? They had actually normal size type 1 fibers in that scenario. This isn't the first study to demonstrate. There's a study from Allway from like 1989. There's a really nice older review from Jose Antonio discussing the idea of hyperplasia. Um, and he has a particular study which I could go into. It's the most impressive study in all of the exercise physiology realm. In this case, it was done with quail. It was a progressive stretch overload model where they found that as the muscle grew, the fibers actually were becoming smaller at one point in time because more and more fibers were being produced. So you have this situation where hypertrophy does happen. We see muscle cell size growing on the short term. Most studies are 8, 12, maybe 6 months long. But when we look at these comparisons between bodybuilders who've been training for years with control subjects, there's a few studies that have done this and seen that the larger muscle mass is not accounted for just by larger fiber sizes. So fiber hypertrophy indicates the muscle's getting larger, but there's potentially hyperplasia going on there as well. So the muscle can be growing. And for instance, in this stretch overload model, I don't know if the listeners would know what I'm talking about here when I throw out some of these terms. So this is a model with quail. They hang a weight off the quail's wing. In this case, Antonio's a model was to start with a lighter weight, hang it for 1 or 2 days, give them a day's break, and then add a heavier weight. So it wasn't exactly like the model of resistance exercise, but closer than just continuous weighting. And they produced over 200%, I think 300% increase in muscle wet weight for the anterior latissimus dorsi muscle. So it would be like akin to hanging a dumbbell off your hand, like strapping it to your hand and carrying it around all the time and watching what happens to your trap, right? All day long. So this is very different than resistance exercise. But you see there that fiber number is going up dramatically. And that is initially fiber size started to go up over the first week or two. And then fiber size went back down, even though the muscle kept on growing at a continuous rate. So fiber hypertrophy and muscle growth are not, in my mind, synonymous when you look at the grand scheme of all the models, animal models and human models that we have. And um, when you're looking at muscle thickness, for instance, with an ultrasound or muscle cross-sectional area, you could also do it with an ultrasound. With an MRI, it would be a more normal, more usual approach. That's whole muscle growth. I just call it muscle growth because the fibers growing, the hypertrophy per se doesn't capture the whole picture.
That makes perfect
So,
sense why you would
yeah.
make the distinction between the two terms, actually. Thank you for explaining.
Hmm.
Now, in terms of measuring muscle growth in the lab, something that you brought up in our email exchange when we were discussing the topic was you said it would be great to talk about measurement reliability, accuracy, precision, and validity in a general sense to start this conversation on measures of muscle growth. And that's exactly where I would want to take us next, because these terms are, again, important to define for everybody's
Yeah.
understanding.
So yeah, those terms. This is just a general thing. We don't have to go into the specifics of the statistics. I think we lose probably a lot of people that went there, and that's not my area of expertise. Um, but a reliable measure. Sometimes people talk about is it reliable, and they mean that is it good in some way, shape, or form. But in laboratory science and the exercise sciences, reliability usually refers to a test retest correlation coefficient. So, can you make a measurement, step away from the measurement, come back from scratch, and make that measurement again and get something that's very close to what you just got? So, for instance, this is something if anyone out there has ever done skin folds or had someone do skin folds, a lot of times you will do all 7 skin folds if you're doing a 7 skin fold assessment, and then you come around and do them again. But if you took one skin fold, took it, and then went right back to it and took it again, you would have squeezed out fluid potentially and deformed that tissue so that you could get a lower number the more times you do that. I've seen people actually do that to try to make their clients think they're making more progress than they have. But how well you can, that's a function of the skill of the practitioner, how well they're paying attention to the methodology. So that's reliability. And that's really, really important. If you, for instance, um, I I had a scale once, and I use scale weight during peak week for bodybuilders. And I've bought scales, just cheap scale, just to weigh myself throughout the course of peak week. I use scale weight as a surrogate for water weight during carbing up, dropping water. And I've had scales where I get on there and it could tell me, okay, you're 200 pounds, and I step off, I let the scale reset, step back on, I'm 202.5, right? I get back off, I'm 198.7, like all over the place. That is not a reliable scale. I would not rely on that scale, right? So if you have someone on who's the measurement itself is unreliable, just the methodology or maybe the practitioner, um, that makes a huge difference as to how the power of your experimental design. If you, for instance, are in that peak week scenario, right, or you're someone who's weighing yourself, let's say once a week, and you're using weight, you're going to use the scale, you're going to be careful about it, and you've got 2 pounds either direction. You may have lost 2 pounds, but you get on the scale, and for whatever reason, that scale's not reliable, and it gives you 2 pounds over the weight that you actually are. And you're like, "Ah, what the world? I did everything right this week. I look better. And the scale's exactly, this scale. This may be part of the reason why people have really problems with scales because they can lie to you if they're not good. So that's something you can test at home. Buy a scale. If it doesn't give you literally the same number dead on, a digital one, and just throw the scale out. So that's reliability. Accuracy is whether a particular measurement is actually giving you the value that you want, right? So let's say you have one scale that is your criterion scale, right? And you have another scale that you want to see how accurate that scale is. And that scale, this happens as well at bodybuilding shows. Example, like so that sometimes I even see people say, get a scale that weighs people light, that's intentionally inaccurate, because then you don't have people coming in who have their scales and which maybe were a lot of light anyway, and they're overweight and they have to take drastic measures to make body weight for their weight class, let's say, and that keeps people from doing silly things. It's just safer for the athletes to give them a little leeway. So accuracy is how well your measurement actually tells you what the true value is, if that can even be measured. So an example, just leaping forward here, is DEXA, so dual emission X-ray absorptiometry, which a lot of people probably know about. It's becoming favored as a really, really um, accurate way, actually. I mean, accurate in this sense of determining body composition. So although you can't do this with humans, some of the early studies, and you don't know exactly what's going on behind the different brands, because there's Lunar, Hologic, and another one I'm forgetting the name, but they're different brands that will give you slightly different numbers. But there are studies with DEXA where they put animal carcasses on the DEXA, and it's just scanning with two X-ray strengths, and it basically determines, using the algorithm and the extent to which those X-rays pass through the tissue, to figure out what the composition of the tissue is, in terms of, in case of the DEXA, bone, fat, and then everything else, the lean body mass, or the bone mineral, and then everything else is the lean body mass, the LBM. You can take those estimates of body fat from an animal carcass and then do a chemical analysis where they actually put the whole carcass into a vat and they separate chemically the fat and everything else, and it will be dead on. The DEXA nails it with high accuracy. Okay, so it's a very, very accurate. At least you
That
can't
is so
obviously do
cool.
that with people. Yeah, it's very, very cool. So those are some of the original studies. Um, at least that tells you that DEXA is pretty accurate. Precision, a precise measurement, is the extent to which you can know to a finer degree whether the measurement, what you're getting. So if you have, let's say, like a tape measure, right, and you want to measure the width of a bolt that you have, so you can go to the hardware store, right, and it just has these real rough gradations, and you're like, oh man, I think that's like about maybe 6 millimeters. I can't tell. So six. It may be, I can't say if it's 6.1 or 6.15 or 6.2. And then you take a caliper, a very precise caliper meant for this purpose, and you actually measure the width of the bolt. And you know then from the caliper, say it's a digital caliper, that it's 6.123. It gives you a more precise measurement. That's what precision is about knowing the number in mathematical terms of significant digits that you have. So if you have a number of in an experimental situation, you have a number of measurements that are being made, and you have one that's very imprecise and one that's very precise, you're going to be very limited by the precision of what your outcome measure is going to be limited by the weakest link precision wise in the series of measurements you've made, right? So let's say it's that bolt, and you want to know the length. You need to get the exact same length, and you want to know the diameter of it, or the width of it. And you measure the length with the caliper, but the width with your tape measure, right? So you know exactly how long it is, but you go to the hardware store and you're like, oh man, this could be two or three of these bolts because they're all about the same. You don't know, you don't have a precise measure, so you end up not knowing which bolt. So you're limited by the precision of your least precise measurement. And then validity is the most important one. So we can talk about this idea of hypertrophy and muscle growth. So if you want to look at the validity of a particular measurement, the validity tells you to what extent does that measurement represent a criterion measure, what we're actually trying to get an assessment of. So let's say you've got a bunch of bodybuilders, highly trained bodybuilders. These guys are all yoked. They come in like this D'Antona study that I mentioned before. The vastus lateralis is very, very large. And you're like, okay, we're going to, biopsies are the bomb, right? We're going right in there. We're measuring fiber size. This is going to tell us how much bigger these muscles are than our control group. Take the biopsies, and the muscle fiber cross-sectional area is only 14% bigger. And you're like, how can that be? This doesn't the validity is very poor here, because what I want to know is how much more muscle mass they have. How much bigger are their muscles? So in this case, fiber cross-sectional area from a biopsy is not a very valid measure of your criterion. What is the difference in muscle mass, or what is the difference in the size of the vastus lateralis in particular? And that's where a more valid measurement would be an MRI, which they also did in this study, which is really important. Now, in order to truly validate a measure against your best criterion measure, in this case, you would have to take away the vastus lateralis and weigh it, get a wet weight, put it on a scale, right? Obviously, you can't do that. So
I
your
mean, I
yeah,
could, but it wouldn't be
you
legal.
could, yeah. Then that's it. Look, and you just say, hey, look how big my quad used to be. Check out the study from this year, right? I used to have big quads, but I donated them to science. So, so that's the difference between reliability, accuracy, precision, and then validity. And validity is the thing I think we're getting at here, because from the sense of someone who wants to measure their muscle growth or be able to assess their muscle growth, and what matters from a competitive bodybuilder's perspective is how they look on stage. How developed do the muscles look? Right? It's really the criterion measurement is a subjective one. Or for the hobbyist bodybuilder who's looking for an aesthetic, the criterion measurement is an aesthetic one. It's how you look, how you look in the mirror. Um, I The inverse of this, I used back in my college, my professorial days, I would teach body composition labs, and we'd have to do skin folds. We went through various things. We're always kind of a touchy thing, and especially with the female students then, I think, and probably now, telling someone what their body fat is was always kind of an iffy thing. So I would kind of start the lab out and I say, hey guys, we'll put the women together and the men together. We'll make sure everyone's comfortable in how we do this, right? Eventually, you're going to have to, as a professional, if you're doing skin folds, you're going to be a guy that's got to do it on a woman or vice versa. So you're going to have to get used to that. But for now, we'll start off. But I tell you what, it's important to keep in mind is that don't over exaggerate or don't overemphasize what this value means. I've never heard a guy say, wow, she's really attractive. What a beautiful body she has. But I heard in a lab that her body fat percentage was 21%, and 20 is my cutoff. I don't go higher than that no matter what. So that body fat estimate from a lab is not at all valid for this hypothetical guy's aesthetic as far as leanness or the appearance of being fit. So validity is very, very important here because you're not going to be able to use the other way around. I'm able to use those lab measurements, which we can talk about here, taking biopsies or MRI or ultrasound, unless you enter into a study. To use those as your criterion measures, you're going to have to use the field measures as they would be known to figure this out. So um, that's the last bit about validity is just keeping in mind, just like, okay, don't get wrapped up in these numbers because some of them you can't measure. And what's important at the end of the day is what your criterion measurement is, and this is how you look and feel, I think, for the most part. So
I think that's really important to emphasize because of all the knowledge you've shared so far. A really important learning point when assessing research, when you're presented with any kind of research on social media, is compare what you're thinking the question is to what the question the researchers asked actually is. Because
absolutely.
sometimes, again, you come across a post or you come across a reel that's telling you this latest study has found that muscle growth was 50% more when you were doing this exercise versus this exercise. But that's what the content creator thought was being measured. But what if the researchers were actually measuring fiber cross-sectional area? Then that's
Right.
not the same. We're not
It's not
answering
the
the
same
same
thing.
question here. So that's
No.
why it's so important to understand the concept of validity, I think, as you've
Yeah.
been very clear to explain, Scott. So now when it
One
comes
thing
to
there, sorry,
go
but I
ahead.
didn't interrupt. One thing there that's important, that's a term that I also often use, is called external validity. And it fits with what you just said, is to what extent can we take the results of this study and externalize them to the situation, to another situation, or in this case, to the situation of the person reading the study, right? So if someone says, like people talk about training the lengthened position or lengthened partials and those sorts of things, and those studies are often very short term. let's say you look at a study with beginners. There are some with more advanced individuals, but look at a study with beginners, and it suggests that that's the case, right? That lengthened partials or train length position produces greater muscle growth. I'm not going to go into all the weeds of sarcomerogenesis and the limit how that should become the muscles just can't keep on getting longer, or the pennation angles just can't keep on changing indefinitely. Eventually, you run into anatomical constraints there. But the question there of external validity would be, okay, this is something that happened in people who had never trained before. I'm an advanced trainee. I've been training in lengthened positions. I've been intentionally doing that for years, recognizing that variation training is important, full range of motion, et cetera. Is that something that I can exploit? Is there external validity? Can we say from that study that its external validity is strong with respect to what I would do as someone who's been at it for a decade or longer? So, external validity means, can this study be then extrapolated to situations outside of what was studied there? The population, the type of training strategy they used, lengthened partials versus just full range of motion. There's a million ways you can look at this. So, that's an important aspect of validity, is externalizing the study to see if it's valid outside of the study constraints.
That's a really good point because
Yeah.
sometimes studies can be proof of concept, basically just
Mm,
researchers nerding out that we can't really use them yet.
right.
Or it's the
Right.
first study on one topic, and it might be that the results are accurate, but if it's just one study, we can't really make anything of it just yet. It would be like
Right.
jumping on a brand new supplement when there's one study backing up its usage. Well, I would want to wait for at least a few more to come out before I decide to spend money on it. Anyway, so thank you for that aside. It was really
Hmm.
valuable. Now, coming on to the description, basic description of these measurements of muscle growth, you can list them in the order that you find would be most helpful, Scott. It could be from the most reliable and accurate and valid to the least, or however you want to list them. It's fine by me.
Yeah. So what we often do, and I think it would probably muddy the waters if I tried to subcategorize them by those four basically statistical notions: reliability,
Yes,
accuracy,
true.
precision, validity. But what has been done, and for many years past, before the technology has become available and is been more widely used, is just to look at body composition from a two-component model. So fat mass and fat-free mass. And then as far as muscle growth goes, the fat-free mass would be a surrogate for that. The presumption is that if you do something that increases muscle mass, that's a component of the fat-free mass. You don't knowingly have anything else that's going to make your organs grow or going to make the skin thicker. There are things that could do that, but the presumption then is that it's the muscle mass which is making the fat-free mass component grow, and then that is indicative of muscle mass. Um, there are underlying assumptions there. So there's actually a number of methods that are based on densitometry. So the idea is that the density of the fat mass is different than the density of the fat-free mass. And there's assumptions there. The density of the fat-free mass is not the same for everyone. The density values that are used, there's two equations. There's a Brozek and a Siri equation, which are the main ones that are used. Um, and those are based on limited cadaver studies, actually. This is a very, very deep field. You can get way into the weeds with this. Um, but those basically presume that there's fat and fat-free mass. And underwater weighing or hydrostatic weighing was considered the gold standard. You can look that up. People still say that for years and years. What you do is you put people underwater, you measure their body density, and then based on these two equations, that will tell you that because fat would float and fat-free mass would sink, that their weight underwater versus their weight based on Archimedes' principle. We can figure out what their body volume is, what their body mass is, get their body density, and you know how much fat they have and how much fat-free mass they have. You can do the same thing with the bod pod, which those are become more widely available. The bod pod works on a sort of it's an air displacement plethysmography principle. So basically, you get in the egg, and they compress chambers within the egg, and they can use the changes in pressure as these known volumes change to figure out what your volume is. You measure your mass on a scale, you get your weight, you get your mass from that on the scale, and then you have your body density. Uses the same calculations as underwater weighing. If you go and get skin folds, and these seem like very totally different things. One thing you're dry, the other one you get wet. You have to blow all your air out, or you can actually measure. Um, you can measure the volume of air in your lungs and do it that way. Various ways this can be done with underwater weighing. But when you go and do skin folds, you're actually pinching around to various places. Those skin folds actually predict what your underwater weighing values would be in terms of your body density, and then runs it through the same equations to get your fat and your fat free mass. So all of those methods are based on the same idea. Um, the thing is, and you've already covered BIA, so we won't get into that too much. That's based on another principle, that impedance of the body is representative of hydration state, and there's some algorithms there that are intellectual property that you can't really get at to see what's going on. But um, BIA in the commercial sense, the scales, and I think you said, I didn't find the podcast. I looked for it, but it must have been a while back. Um, those are notoriously horrible at home. I'll just say this: I have one that I bought just because the scale was electronic and I could kind of monitor things, and I wanted to do this a few years back. And between a body weight of about 210, where DEXA put me at 4% body fat, and well over 230, where I wasn't 4% body fat, um, I never got below 28% body fat or above 32% body fat any time whatsoever. It never changed my body fat at all. It was like
Wow.
I couldn't even figure out how it could be having this error. It was just this was a highly rated scale I bought on Amazon. So, um, but those are ways of determining fat and fat free mass. The BIA does it as well. The bioelectrical impedance is different forms of that, and then the fat free mass would be your indicator of muscle mass. Another like a story from BIA, and this would be fun to try. So back in my graduate school days, one of the labs where I went to school with George was Kurt Curitin's lab. I think he's since retired. He was a body composition specialist, and they would get things to test, and they had a BIA scale, a very early sort of prototypical one. The diet I was doing involved low calories, higher protein, close to ketogenic for 3 days. It's called a rebound dieting. Um, People can look that up if they want. And then you would go from 3 days of that to eating massive amounts of food. It was a lot of fun to do. Go to an all-you-can-eat buffet, tons of sodium, tons of water, and I would reliably gain 10 pounds between a Wednesday morning measurement, no, a Thursday morning measurement, and a Friday morning measurement. After I'd had that massive feast of, I go from 1,200, 1,500 calories a day to 7,000, right? And gain 10 pounds, and my body fat would, of course, go down, and I would gain like 15 pounds of fat-free mass, right? Because I completely distorted my hydration status. And so the underlying principles of BIA and even the densitometry principles is that there's a hydration status which is constant. So that's the thing that's going to change when people are dieting down. You can gain muscle mass. I was gaining like 12, 15 pounds of muscle mass in 24 hours according to this BIA scale. Of course, that's not happening. I was just changing my hydration status. I wasn't losing all this fat. I wasn't magically transforming. That was all just water and glycogen. So that's important. So more direct measurements and things you mentioned in the email. The one that's done much more now is ultrasound. Let me Before we get to that, we'll go to another component model. That's DEXA, which I mentioned before. DEXA gives you it's a 3-component model, so it gives you fat, and then the fat-free mass is made up of bone mineral and then lean body mass. And that's actually a very contentious term in the body composition literature, because sometimes people say lean body mass and fat free mass, they use that synonymously. DEXA, when it says lean body mass, it doesn't mean the same as fat free mass that you might get from an underwater weighing. And there also historically, lean body mass has been used to mean fat-free mass, and then essential fat that's sort of thought to be essential for normal physiological, especially hormonal function. So it's like think it's like 3% for men and 12% for women, something like that. So that would be, so you take some percentage of the fat and add that to your fat-free mass, and that becomes your lean body mass. So regardless of all those details, what's important to do when you're using any of these to try to get an indirect assessment of muscle mass is to maintain your diet, maintain your hydration, same time of day, same day of the week. If you do have some variations, if someone is eating more on the weekends, they're doing a Sunday carb up of some sort, and you should then make your measurements on Wednesday. If Wednesday is the day, your off day that you don't train, all those things that can change your hydration state are going to change potentially the values that you get and throw off and give you less reliability because you've got this intrinsic variation that's created by the extrinsic circumstances of changes in your diet and different training days, what have you. So if you're going to use any of those, which you can, and I'll talk about a method that I put forth in my book to try to use DEXA as a along with skin folds in conjunction as a way to kind of get a better idea of what's going on in muscle mass and to save yourself some money. So those are indirect body composition um, methods. And then we can get to and those are all used in the research. You don't see underwater weighing too much, and maybe for like a master's thesis, where they have the tank and they just to show people how to use it. But that is most of the time, if you want to get a measure of muscle size or muscle growth, or people would call muscle hypertrophy, then you're going to look at ultrasound, potentially a biopsy, or an MRI. Those are going to be the main ones. So ultrasound, I'm not an expert with ultrasound. It's cheap, can be pretty reliable. You need to look at each lab. Lab should have the first time they introduce ultrasound into their line of research, it should be somewhere in an early research study what their reliability is. They should have a correlation coefficient. It should be, zero point 0.9 something for sure. If it's lower than that, you're in trouble. It means they're all over the place. And that will give you a thickness measurement. The thing that's interesting here is if you look, Sam Buckner has a really nice paper that came out a couple of years ago now. He's at university. You know Sam, know of Sam, I'm sure. Yeah, so I love the fight that he's fighting because he's sort of stepping back against sort of the establishment of this dose response and looking at it in an extraordinarily deep scientific fashion. He has this nice review article that he put together with some other authors, and he has a table looking at the actual increases in muscle thickness that you see with ultrasound. And we're not talking about, muscles that are becoming, an inch thicker. We're talking about 0.2 centimeters, something like that, like 20 millimeters or 2 millimeters, right? Or like a half a centimeter would be a
Basically, not
tremendous
even visible to the human eye.
things that you wouldn't pick up in the human eye. Um, and that's important to know. I used MRI for my dissertation, and one of the subjects, what we did was left one leg as a control and trained the other leg with electrical stimulation. Just an 8-week long study, but you can produce, at least from the previous research done with this methodology, about twice the rate of muscle growth that you would with voluntary training. So there's advantages and disadvantages there. But we got about 6 to 10% increase in whole muscle cross sectional area. And I had one subject, I don't remember which group he was in, but he gained 20% increase in muscle cross sectional area. That was substantial. That was noticeable. That's about what you can get from if you get a massive pump during a workout. And a lot of these guys would come in because they started getting self-conscious. The leg we were training was getting bigger than the other leg. And when we would put him through the training rigor, especially as we increased the sets progressively over the time, that leg we trained would be pumped alongside already being larger. And by the time they got done, when they walked out wearing shorts, you could noticeably see that one leg was a lot bigger than the other one. That's noticeable. 20% increase in muscle cross sectional area is for a quad, for instance, is highly noticeable, right? But so you have to sort of have some idea of like what do these things practically mean. 3% you wouldn't possibly see. 5% would be noticeable. for an MRI. When you're talking about gains that are that would be considered statistically significant on an ultrasound, we're talking about very small changes in thickness, but that's going to be different when you look at the whole muscle cross sectional area, right? Because that's just in one direction. So anyway, ultrasound can be used. That's not something most people can do at home, right? And then MRI, uh, and then biopsies. That is what's going to tell us about what's going on with the fibers per se. But again, that doesn't necessarily represent what you might see when you look at really large people who are highly trained with lots of muscle mass. The fiber cross section area might not be telling you. So you need to realize that I think that there's limitation to each of these things. The ultrasound, the MRI, the biopsies, those aren't available to anyone, right? But those are the basic ways in which they can be used. You can see, for instance, a 50% increase in fiber cross-sectional area. There's a study from Bob Stearns' lab in 1990. They trained the bejesus out of women for months on end. They just did lower body training. It was like 16 sets to failure twice a week. They really nailed them. And they got in the type 2 fibers, maybe the type 2As, like over a 50% average increase in fiber cross-section area. Compare that might have been, I don't know, 20% fiber cross-sectional area, or sort of whole muscle cross-section area in an MRI, right? So if you see one measurement that says 30% in terms of fibers, that doesn't represent what may be going on in the whole muscle. So this is what's interesting. The whole muscle in the long term can be much larger than what the fibers would suggest. But in the short term, fiber cross-section area growth can be much greater percentage-wise than what you'll see in terms of whole muscle growth. Another thing that indicates there might be something fishy going on with fiber number and hyperplasia. So I think what the important part, because I don't want to run too long here, we got about maybe 20, 25 minutes.
Oh, I already know I'm gonna have to ask you for a part two, Scott, because I
Okay,
don't want
yeah,
to
I usually do
interrupt.
this. Yeah,
And
I usually do
yeah,
this.
I told you in the email, I am usually way too optimistic about how much I put in outline, but I'm also very happy to bring guests back on if they want to come back.
Yeah, we definitely we can do that. So,
Perfect.
um, so what's the bottom line here? I mean, how can you get an idea of these things at home? Our validity, our criterion measurement is how you look in the mirror, right? So, as far as utilizing those body composition measurements to get something that's more objective, because our minds will play tricks on us. Most people in the bodybuilding, we have some sort of some form of body dysmorphia, some distorted body image. I'm, in my opinion, compared to my competitive days when I was pressing all the levers, I'm nowhere near the person I was. But people sometimes see me like, oh my god, blah blah blah. I don't have that perception myself. So your mind will play tricks on you, um, for many people. But what can be done, this is what I put forth in my book, and I've had just a few people do this. DEXA is what's sometimes people they use the gold standard. It's one of the best indirect measurements we have that's readily available to many people. You can get this done. Women's clinics have them for measuring bone mineral density. There are many places now that make them available, in particular for body composition assessment. Very accurate, very reliable. Actually, they can. There's a study I saw. I actually saw it presented by the guy who did it, and they used the DEXA scan to figure out the components of fat, of lean body mass, fat, and mineral density, and then the masses of those based on a two-dimensional DEXA scan, and added those all together to get body weight. And then, of course, he weighed the individuals as well on a research grade scale, and the correlation between those measurements was 1.0. It was perfect. He felt almost embarrassed to present that because DEXA doesn't weigh you, but it gives you a body weight that matches what you get on the scale. It's almost always dead on. So DEXA can be used under those controlled circumstances. And what someone could also do is, knowing how they look, knowing what the DEXA tells you in terms of what your percent body fat is take skin folds of yourself. You have to get practice at this. You don't need to get a research grade skin fold caliper. Get a decent one from Amazon. Some of them are just junk, you can tell, but get a decent one on Amazon. Get practice at it and take skin folds, or maybe have a significant other, someone, training partner, someone you can count on. to then get a skin fold assessment at the time points which you make this DEX assessment. So let's say you get 4 skin folds. Say you hold you'll fat on your thigh, somewhere on your ab, somewhere on your iliac region, on your pec region, something like that. Those would be your skin folds. Those are the spots that you want to assess. It doesn't have to translate into some body fat estimation by a Jackson-Pollock equation or what have you. You don't care about that. You don't care about the number. You don't like I said, no one says, oh, she's 21% body fat, she's not attracted to me because the number came out of the lab. They don't ask you what your percent body fat is when you get on stage. But you have this value, and then when you get those values and you're certain of your measurements, they're reliable, you can take the skin folds over and over again and get the same number. Then you get a DEXA measurement. And then when your skin fold total equals 42, you're at 15% body fat, right? And when your skin fold total, you diet down and you're a week or two out from a show, or you're for a photo shoot, or your summer body or whatever, getting ready for your wedding, and you make those measurements, and the total is 19, and that puts you at 8% body fat, then you know this, right? And then the thing, and this hasn't been validated, this hasn't been done in a research study, but once you've made measurements across the spectrum of body fat that you have, and then over time, let's say 3 years into it, you get back down to, what did I say, 18 millimeters as a total for those 4 skin folds, but now you weigh 8 pounds more, right? That would suggest that a large percent of those 8 pounds are going to be fat-free mass, right? Hopefully muscle mass. You could go and do another DEXA and check this out. But if you have a body fat estimate based on the skin folds of the places that are most important. So if you don't hold fat on your thigh, like I have no fat on my thighs, like there's just not, it's just like skin on the back of the hand. That's just the way my body fat's distributed. But I got tons of it on the love handles. It's all over the place, right? That's where I would measure this. That's where I distribute my body fat. Then I can use that measurement to get an actual body fat estimate based on DEXA. So I have my criterion measure, and I have my own skin folds that I'm using that are specific to me and my body fat distribution and how I do that. And then you can go back and use that whenever you want. So you could go back 10 years later and say, okay, look, well, I'm actually 5 pounds lighter and my skin folds were just as high when I was at, well, it's like, okay, and I can maybe see this in the mirror too, but that gives you something aside from the mirror. It's much more objective as long as you're not fudging your skin folds. And you could, of course, go back and do another. DEXAs are like $60, $100. I've seen them as low as 60, I think, if you wait for like a sale, that kind of stuff. So it's not terribly expensive. But that's a way people could actually get a true estimate. More practical, hands-on stuff, I'm of the belief that in some way, shape, or form and function are going to be connected with one another. We're trying to evoke a hack to create a muscular callus through bodybuilding, right? We're trying to get the body to accumulate muscle mass in response to this stress that we produce. You can adapt to the stress of weight training in ways that are much more economical in terms of energy expenditure, just by neurological adaptations, simply increasing the endurance capacity of the muscle. You can have, if you get a muscle that becomes more fatigue resistant, and now instead of getting 8 reps with 200 pounds, you're getting 12 reps with 200 pounds. That's an improvement as well. But that being said, if you use a high volume approach where you're not going to failure, you're not trying to push the loads, but you find, for instance, that across the 12 or 15 sets that you do, that your reps don't drop off, you could do a volume load calculation. And over time, you see that your performance in the gym, in terms of the weight you're using, that's the easiest one. You're lifting heavier loads for the same number of reps, and your reps aren't dropping off set by set, or their drop off is the same, but now you're using heavier loads, so the relative drop off is equivalent. You've got that, your performance has gone up, and your body weight has gone up, and the mirror tells you what's going on, and perhaps even you've gone to the lengths of measuring your skin folds. So you weigh 10 pounds more, you're using 20% greater loads, you're not dropping like a rock into a pond on your sets, So you've got good endurance, and I think there's something to say for this. There are many guys who do really well growing. And a lot of these guys are enhanced, but some guys don't really push the progressive overload. But their performance definitely improves over time. Um, and your skin folds are the same with a higher body weight. Then all those pieces basically could be a basis for conjecturing that you've gained muscle mass, and you're going to be able to see that, I think, in most cases. Um, from an even more extreme, like, okay, let's just go to bare bones standpoint. This is what I tell people sometimes. Depends on the client. If there's someone who has never really utilized a pure progressive overload perspective, I will say, okay, so what would happen if you ate to support the gains and you took yourself from your current strength level and performance level within the parameters of what you're willing to do to make yourself better as a bodybuilder, and you just tried to become the biggest and strongest guy in the gym. You wanted to double all your weight. Let's say you have 5 years to double all the loads that you use on all your basic exercises. And you didn't restrict your food along the way. Maybe even you let your body fat go up a little bit, but you get twice as strong as you currently are. There's going to be some muscle mass that comes along with this. This doesn't mean that there aren't neurological gains that come with that. If you just train like a power lifter and all you want to do is improve your squat, there are many powerlifters who can get much stronger staying in the same weight class. Olympic lifters do that too, especially. They try to get stronger and keep their weight lower. Um, but as a bodybuilder, that that strength measurement or that performance measurement, so you could volume load or whatever, that I think is very, very important. And the focus nowadays, and this doesn't mean it's completely misplaced, but the focus nowadays has been on, okay, how do I pick the right exercise, pick the right loading curve, have the right tempo, make sure I've got full range of motion, exercise selection and sequencing, and all these kinds of things. They all are important. They can all you could have do all those things wrong and do all those things right, I think, and have your training efforts be the same, and maybe get more growth out of the right exercise selection, etc. For sure. However, I still think that if someone does all those things, and you take the person who just worries about keeping a couple reps in reserve, they don't worry about progressing the loads, keeping that equivalent form and tempo in place, and they don't have an eye on becoming the most impressive lifter that they possibly can, that person will not make the same progress as the person who has a do or die attitude and says, I'm going to get as strong as humanly possible using safe form, using a full range of motion whenever possible, not sacrificing load for form and mind muscle connection, because that's definitely, I think, a mistake. I've made it many times. However, that being said, and this is an age-old topic. People talk about you got to bench, squat, and deadlift, and they pick these really, really difficult basic core exercises, and they say that's the way to go. Um, there's a mindset that comes with that. If you go in, and pardon my French here, but if you go in and say, I'm going to make gravity my bitch today, that's what it comes down to, right? That's the attitude I have. And you do that for years on end, right? And you have that attitude, and that attitude comes hand in hand with picking those exercises. There's something to say for someone. It's like finding the right angles, so to speak, doing an approach where you're looking for new and novel exercises, as Dante Trudel would say, getting funky with it. Because after you gain a certain amount of muscle mass, you're going to have to find new approaches in order to fill in holes in your physique or to produce growth where it wasn't once there. You're going to need some novelty of stimulus, which is a form of overload in my mind. But I think the person who has that approach, that gravity will lose today and every day that I go into the gym, excepting for my deloads, I have to train and periodize in a smart way. Having that attitude, that's what comes along with those exercises. Does it mean that a barbell squat is going to be best for everyone's biomechanics and their hip structure? Well, no, of course not. You can get a full range of motion if you get on a certain hack squat, or you foot placement on a certain leg press, or a Smith squat, or what have you. So be smart with that. But I think all in all, I think this old school perception that those core exercises, those hardcore exercises are the way to go, comes from the fact that the people who take that on have a different perspective about progressive overload. And they want to go in the gym and leave people drop jawed at the stuff that they just did. And they want to do stuff that no one else would do. Like, I train harder than everyone else, like, blah, blah, blah. That whole idea. It's very egotistical, but that driven, obsessive type of mindset is really what you hardly ever see in gyms, and you hardly ever see people who make massive transformations. Some of that's genetics, without a doubt. There's a huge um, Gaussian bell curve there as terms of how much muscle mass people can put on, but you rarely see people who are training like their life depended on it. Those two approaches, picking all the aspects of training um, that you've talked about probably on innumerable podcasts already. That's more of the talk now, and rightfully so. I think those things haven't been exploited the way they could. But taking that and marrying it with um, this barbell is going to be weeping by the time we're done, or this machine's going to be weeping, right? Or what have you. I mean, we used to like it used to be like a badge of honor to have broken a machine because you overloaded it so much, right? Not that you want to go in and break people's machines, but I mean, I have a funny story. So when I lived in Georgia, this was during my postdoc. I was actually taking classes for this graduate certificate I talked about, and there's this gym that I would go to in Carrollton, Georgia. I think it was a World Gym, and I always wanted to go train there. And I drive by, I'm like, oh man, I want to go to this gym. So eventually I made time so I could put my training schedule in there. And I only got into the gym like 3 times. But as it turned out, because it's the same day of the week, I was doing weighted dips. I go into this gym, it's first time in the gym, and just kind of a normal gym. It's a good gym, well equipped gym. And I go over to the dip station and I put 4 plates to do dips with. I worked 2, 3, and I got to 4. That was my work set. 4 plates is a good amount of weight, right? I did, I think, a rep or two, and the dip belt broke. Plates come crashing down because I was high up. It was one of those higher, like a pull-up dip station things. So that there's probably like 2 feet, and the plates are rolling. I'm like, oh shit, I'm going to take somebody out because
Oh
45
my
pound plates are
gosh.
rolling. Yeah, it was bad. So I felt really bad. I went and cleaned up my thing. Like, okay, I'm going to do something else. I think I did like the hammer strength dip machine. I brought the I brought the dip belt over. I'm like, hey, I'm so sorry I broke your dip belt. So I think I came in, and not more than a couple weeks later, they had a new dip belt. It was the same. It was basically just the same dip belt. It was new. I don't remember how old the first one was. So I go over and I do the same thing. Right? I broke the dip belt again. I felt really bad. I said, "Hey, I broke your dip belt again." I mean, it doesn't have like a limit on there. It wasn't like one of those Spuds belts. Like, those are really good. This is just like the generic 1999, right? You don't even know if this is real leather type of thing. But that kind of thing's like, hell yeah, I'm going to go in here and break dip belts, break machines, break that mentality. I think is what it takes for many people. And the thing is, very often the most gifted individuals don't have to train that way because they are so gifted. Not that there aren't lots of guys who train really hard at the upper echelons of bodybuilding, but and you don't have to turn into a bloodthirsty maniac every time you go in the gym too. You can be very consistent with the logbook and say, okay, today I need to get 1 or 2 more reps. I'm going to see this in my mind's eye. I'm going to make this happen. This is what needs to happen because literally, although it may not be possible, if you could double your strength from your starting point or maybe your 1 year in point 10 years later, it's going to show. That, I think, that performance aspect, doing stuff you never could have done with weights you never could have used in some way, shape, or form, there's no exact formula there, is going to be the best surrogate measure of your muscle mass, because it's not going to happen without the muscle mass unless you train specifically as a powerlifter, as a strength athlete, to keep your muscle mass and your body weight low. I mean, you could try to keep your body fat low to stay under a weight class, and those guys do all sorts of stuff with their water and that sort of thing. But if you're eating for muscle mass growth, you're making sure you have enough calories to move the scale weight up. I'll give another more practical example. This is such a common one. I have a discussion board for people who bought my training system, Fortitude Training, and that's just to support anyone who buys the ebook. Apologies to people who go on there. Like right now, the format, the skin is all screwed up. I'm still trying. It happens every few years. I got to figure it out. But a question I've gotten 6 times maybe on that board, and I've gotten innumerable times otherwise as well. If you got someone it's a guy, 2-3 years in, he's made his gains, he's passed the newbie gains, he weighs 185 pounds, reasonable weight, he's put on 10, 15 pounds, and his arms are small or arms are weak. Or at least that's his perception, because big arms are important. When you go out to the bar, to the club, you want to have big arms. That's the main thing. And he's been at it for, let's say, another year or two, right? And he's doing this, that, and the other, and he's trying all these different things. And his arms aren't getting any bigger. And I say, well, okay, well, what, you started this 2 years ago. What did you weigh then? He's like, oh, like 185. I got it in my logbook. I'm paying attention. What do you weigh now? He's like, oh, I'm like about 186, maybe 187. Like, there you have it. You can grow, like, there's recomp that's very well documented. You can lose fat and gain muscle mass at the same time. When people start a novel regime or have never trained before, that can definitely happen, but that's not going to happen indefinitely. So at some point, and this is the thing we don't have studies on. We don't have studies where, we look at the factors that allow someone after the first 2 years of training to make progress during the next 5 years of training. We don't have 7-year studies. We have comparison, train versus control, but we don't have those. And when the rubber meets the road in the trenches, that guy, especially for a muscle that doesn't want to grow easily, let's say it's his biceps, his arms in general, body weight's going to have to go up. Everything's going to have to grow alongside. And he may get better growth. It's like, oh, my legs are too big. I don't like how I've seen this before. They're too big. Or what have you. But everything's going to have to grow. And you're going to maybe that lagging muscle group, maybe you can bring it on part of the others by focusing on it and do the things you could do to do that. But everything's going to happen. So in this case, to our question here, the surrogate for muscle mass is going to be body weight, of course, paying attention to your body fat. And you can do that with skin folds, as I outlined before. But in order to get those biceps to grow, everything's going to have to grow alongside it. You're not going to be able to let's say someone just trained their upper body. There's numerous examples of that. Their upper body grows, their legs don't, right? But at some point in time, if they wanted to get more upper body growth after doing that for 5 years, they're going to have to gain body weight. Everything's going to have to grow and go. So body weight, although as much as I hate to say that, everything's going to have to get bigger at some point in time. Once you're probably to the place that many of the listeners already are, and that they're at least intermediate in their training and trying to, because the law of diminishing returns does rule the roost here. So, so those are the basic things. Your performance, I think, is penultimate. There's almost no way you can say that it doesn't matter. In my mind at least. And that's the thing that, and I think we're running out of time here, but that's the thing that I wish I've put this out there. Maybe I should just talk directly with some of the guys who are doing this, but you see progressive overload is universally used in the studies. Like this is this most scientific principle that you see. But what could be done, because they're coming into the lab, the subjects are being trained, they're changing their weights. They say how it's done in the experimental methods, but to what extent does this progression predict the growth? What are the correlations there between who gets the strongest or who has the greatest volume load the last session versus the first session, the relative changes, what have you, and the growth? I would love to see that, because that's the whole idea of progressive overload. If it didn't matter that you progress the loads and that you tried to improve performance, then why would we do that? Because we're looking for a function and form connection here. That's the basic idea of progressive overload. And that's all I'm basically saying. Unfortunately, there's even in the science, it seems there's a disconnect. That seems like that would be a basic value, of basic statistic should be put forth, is we found that those individuals who made the greatest gains in training made the greatest gains in muscle mass. or muscle fiber size, hypertrophy or muscle cross-sectional area or thickness or what have you. But you don't ever see those values. I can't remember the last, there's only a few studies that have actually documented that. And it's available in almost every study because they track all those things and it never gets published for some reason. It's very bizarre to me.
Yeah,
But you
it's
can do
true.
that. Yes.
Yeah, Scott, thank you so much for that. I think what you're encouraging people to do is to focus, to understand the difference between the importance of the variables we're talking about, because you're not saying completely disregard exercise selection, tempo, loading
Oh,
curve, range of
no,
motion, selection, and
no.
order. But you're saying progressive overload is the basic principle underlying adaptations like muscle growth. So that's what I like to use the pebble and rock analogy. Progressive overload would be the big rock for muscle growth, and then it's still important, but to a smaller degree, come all these other variables that we can manipulate to create a training program. Ultimately,
Mm-hmm.
what I think you're saying is that the most effective training program for growth is designed to promote progressive overload. And when you attack a training session, so to speak, your mindset should also be geared towards achieving progressive overload and allowing it to happen in subsequent sessions. Whereas it's easy to get lost in the weeds of other variables because they might seem fashionable because people talk about them these days and they're not important.
I would add a caveat to that is that in the long haul, I think that's the important perspective to have. I've been in this situation. I know many people have. If someone's been over focused on progressive overload, right, and they're just trying to move the logbook, right, there is definitely a use case for focusing on range of motion, mind muscle connection, correct exercise selection, et cetera, where you can do this is actually a basic thing I would have people do is like, okay, we're going to do a reset on everything. I want you to go back, put an infinitesimally short pause at the bottom of your range of motion, and we're going to drop your weights back, focus on like complete restart. And we're not worried about progressive overload at all. But in the grand scheme of things, I think that's the thing that gets missed because people are staying. I mean, I'll say this. I think I could say this. So Ben Pekulski, who's a little bit outside of the bodybuilding area now, but he was very focused on all these aspects for the longest time. And I've talked to Ben. I know Ben. I've been to his gym. But one of the things that he confided in me is he actually, if you can find this, his original system was first get people training as effectively as possible. So out of the set that you do, make it as powerful of a stimulus as possible. Once you've got that down, once you've tweaked your exercise form, your exercise selection, all those features, now start getting massively strong doing it the right way. So don't take an inferior stimulus and try to amplify it. Take the best stimulus you can come up with and then amplify that. And I think that makes sense too, especially if you're looking for long-term musculoskeletal health. So if you can grow with 3 plates on the bar as opposed to 6, heck yeah, do it that way. Do that. But
Yeah.
if you're going to try to stay at 1 plate on the bar and not progress over time, you might be missing the boat because there's a progressive overload come on there. That's important. So that's how I kind of phrase that.
I love that because I
Yeah.
got into the habit of telling my clients, if you take what you're doing now and it's mediocre and you just try to add more and more to that, adding
Yeah.
shit to shit just gives you more
Yeah.
shit.
It's just
Whereas
get more shit.
if we refine the shit and we make it gold, now
Right.
we add gold to gold and we get gold stimulus, like bigger, greater gold
Right.
stimulus over time. That's what we
Yeah.
want. So I really like this final
Yeah.
part that you've mentioned, and I want it to be the end of this part one because I
Okay.
definitely want to delve a bit more into your training philosophy, Scott. But for
Absolutely.
now, let the people know how they can find all of your products. And I think you also do consultations now as a service, and I'll leave the
Hmm.
links in the show notes.
Instagram. I'm not a big fan of social media for that's a whole other topic, but I'm on Instagram, fortitude_training, and there you can get to my website and be your own bodybuilding coach. It's on Amazon. I'm selling it on eBay now with 15% to benefit ASPCA, so American Society for Prevention of Cruelty Against Animals. So if you want to buy the book, it costs the same as anywhere else, but then you're donating to a good charity, I think. So that's my plug. is keep the animals safe.
Excellent. I'll actually have a link for the book to both Amazon and eBay, so it makes it easier
Oh,
for
cool.
people to just find it straight in the show notes. Thanks for letting me know
Awesome.
about the difference. All right,
Yeah, for
Scott,
sure.
thanks so much for your time today. Dear listeners, thank you for tuning in and gifting me and Scott with some of your precious time. And I will talk to you next time.
Adios.
Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.